I want you to close your eyes for a second and just, picture a room in Paris.
Right. The year is 1796. The French Revolution has completely upended society.
Exactly. The air outside is thick with paranoia. It smells like wood smoke, open sewers, and just, well, radical, violent change.
But inside this room, at a private gathering, a man named Nicolas Armez he's reaching into a wooden box.
Yeah, he wants to pull out his prized possession to show his guests. And this object is passed around the room from hand to hand like some kind of macabre party trick.
And you lean in closer to look at it. It is a human face.
A severed head.
Yeah, and it's a staggering, visceral image. But it isn't fresh. I mean, this man has been dead for over a century and a half.
Wow.
The flesh is entirely mummified, perfectly preserved. The skin is like yellowed parchment, stretched agonizingly tight over the cheekbones.
The eye sockets are hollow, but the iconic facial hair, the sharp mustache, the
Yeah.
small pointed beard, it's still perfectly intact.
Right, but this isn't just some anonymous aristocrat who met the guillotine.
No, this is the stolen head of the man who, operating almost entirely in the shadows, basically engineered the modern world.
Exactly.
Welcome to today's deep dive. Our subject is Armand Jean Duplessis, a man much better known to history as Cardinal Richelieu.
The Red Eminence.
The Red Eminence, yeah.
Hmm.
And using sources like the Catholic Encyclopedia, Joseph Bergen's really exhaustive research on his immense wealth, and deeply buried historical archives, our mission today is to track an impossible, terrifying transformation.
It really is an impossible trajectory.
We are going to uncover how a sickly, indebted boy from a minor noble family became a rural priest, then a master of espionage, and ultimately the absolute puppeteer of Europe.
This is a man who burned his political enemies at the stake,
Right.
funded heretic armies to destroy rival empires, and then, bizarrely, took the time to invent the modern table knife.
I mean, the contrast is just wild. It's what makes him so endlessly fascinating and, frankly, so dangerous to study.
To truly understand Richelieu, you have to completely abandon your modern preconceptions of what a religious figure is, supposed to be.
Right.
Armand Jean Duplessis was born in Paris in September 1585, but his roots, his blood, were in the lesser nobility of the Poitou region.
Okay.
And from the very beginning of his life, his existence was defined by a brutal tug-of-war between two realities.
Which were?
A severely fragile physical health on one side, and an all-consuming martial ambition on the other.
He was a delicate child, right?
Yeah, he was prone to terrible sweating fevers that left him completely bedridden, yet his mind was entirely focused on the battlefield.
He didn't want to preach from a pulpit. He wanted to command cavalry.
Exactly. His early education was literally a boot camp for the aristocracy.
He was out there learning the mathematics of siege warfare. He was mastering the rapier in fencing academies, learning courtly dancing.
Yeah, this is the absolute textbook education of a 17th century soldier. He was living the hyper-masculine, indulgent life of a young military officer.
And we know exactly how fully he embraced the darker sides of that life because of a very telling medical record.
Right, the record from 1605.
Yeah, in 1605, at the age of 20, this future cardinal was being treated by a prominent doctor for gonorrhea.
That detail is crucial. It strips away the pious mythology,
Oh, absolutely.
It firmly grounds him in the physical, violent, and highly promiscuous world of the French nobility.
But that world, that trajectory toward military glory was suddenly violently ripped away from him by cold financial realities.
Yeah, his father, François Duplessis, had been a hardened soldier and a courtier, eventually serving as the Grand Provost of France.
Which is basically the chief law enforcement officer of the realm.
Right. But François died of a sudden fever during the French Wars of Religion when Armand was only 5 years old.
And he left the Duplessis family drowning in a terrifying amount of debt.
Drowning is exactly the right word. They were on the verge of absolute ruin.
But the family had one lifeline, right? One asset keeping them from total poverty.
Yes, it was a royal grant. The previous king, Henry III, had rewarded Richelieu's father with the bishopric of Luçon.
Let's pause and explain what a bishopric actually represented to a noble family in 17th century France.
Because it wasn't just a spiritual responsibility. It wasn't just a church and a flock of believers.
No, it was an economic engine.
Exactly. The position came with massive tracts of land, tithes, and tax revenues.
And the Duplessis family was essentially keeping the bishop's seat empty or installing weak proxies so they could skim the ecclesiastical revenues of this bishopric for their own private use.
It was literally the only thing keeping them afloat.
Okay, let's unpack this because the mechanics of this are wild. This is essentially a 17th century mafia family desperately trying to hold on to their territory and their racket.
Yes,
But the territory just happens to be a Catholic diocese.
that is a remarkably accurate, functional analogy. And just like a crime family, their control was being challenged by the locals.
The actual clergymen of Lucon were pushing back.
Yeah, they were writing to Paris, demanding that the funds actually be used for the church, for the poor, for building maintenance.
So to protect their racket, the Duplessis family realized they could no longer just skim from the outside.
Right, they needed to install a legitimate, fully consecrated bishop from their own bloodline.
So the mother, Suzanne, who is fiercely protective of the family's survival, decides that her second son, Alphonse, will take the job.
But Alphonse wants absolutely nothing to do with it. And he doesn't just say no. He actively flees.
Wait, she runs away.
He runs away from his own family and joins the Carthusians.
Which, if we look at what that means, is incredible. The Carthusians are one of the strictest monastic orders in the world.
Yeah, they take a vow of almost total silence. They live in isolated cells.
So Alphonse literally chose a lifetime of silent isolation over being his family's financial placeholder.
It tells you everything about the intense pressure the mother was applying. So with Alphonse gone, the burden falls to the youngest son,
Armand, the soldier.
the young man with gonorrhea who dreams of the cavalry. He is ordered by his mother to abandon the sword for the cloth.
Think about the psychological toll of that specific moment. You are a violent, ambitious, highly trained 20-year-old.
Right.
You want to kill the king's enemies on the battlefield.
Right.
And suddenly your mother sits you down and tells you that you are going to be locked into a rural, muddy, impoverished bishopric for the rest of your life.
Just to pay off your dead father's debts.
Yeah. How does he not just completely break?
The resentment must have been profound. He was essentially being buried alive in the countryside.
But what we see instead of a breakdown is an absolute chilling psychological pivot.
Exactly. Armand realizes that if he's going to be forced into the church, he isn't going to just survive it. He is going to master it.
He is going to turn it into a weapon.
Yes.
Yeah.
But immediately he hits a massive logistical wall.
Hmm.
In 1606, when King Henry IV officially nominates him to be the Bishop of Lucon, Armand is barely 21 years old.
Wait, what is the canonical age requirement for a bishop? Because you can't just hand a diocese to a teenager.
The canonical minimum age set by the church was 30. He is almost a decade too young.
So how does a broke minor noble from the countryside fix a problem like that? I mean, you couldn't just Photoshop a birth certificate in the 17th century.
No, you couldn't. So he does something incredibly brazen. He travels directly to Rome at the end of 1606.
He goes straight to the Vatican.
He secures an audience to get a special dispensation from Pope Paul V. And the historian of Richelieu's youth, Monseigneur Lacroix, points to a fascinating, unresolved historical mystery here.
What's the mystery?
The papal brief from December 1606, which grants the dispensation, explicitly states that Richelieu is in his 23rd year.
So wait, are you saying he walked into the Vatican, stood before the Vicar of Christ, and simply lied to his face about his age?
It appears highly likely. He possessed a terrifying preternatural confidence.
Wow.
He was charming, he was brilliantly educated, and he likely just bent the truth to secure his power.
The first great deception. And it works. He is officially consecrated as a bishop in April 1607.
But this is where the story takes a turn you wouldn't expect.
Yeah, because if he's just there for the money, you'd expect him to sit back in Paris, collect the tithes, and be a corrupt absentee landlord like half the bishops in France at the time.
Exactly. But instead, he goes to Lucon and becomes an absolute zealot for reform.
This is where we see the first glimpse of his genius for administration.
He returns to his diocese in 1608, and he looks at the ruined, impoverished state of his church.
He famously called Lucon the ugliest, filthiest, and most disagreeable bishopric in France.
But he doesn't despair. He gets to work. He becomes the very first bishop in France to fully implement the institutional reforms prescribed by the Council of Trent.
Okay, let's pause and define that for the listener, because Council of Trent sounds like a boring bureaucratic meeting, but it was actually a massive deal, right?
It was huge. It was the Catholic Church's ultimate crisis response to the Protestant Reformation.
Right, because for decades, Martin Luther and the Protestants had been successfully arguing that the Catholic Church was corrupt, uneducated, and morally bankrupt.
The Council of Trent was the Catholic counterattack. It mandated that priests actually had to be educated, they couldn't take mistresses, and bishops had to actually live in their diocese and
Right.
preach.
So Richelieu uses these new rules as a hammer to forge his diocese into shape.
Exactly. He brings in new, highly disciplined religious orders, the Oratorians and the Capuchin friars, to give intensive missions in all the rural parishes.
He demands discipline. He shows immense zeal for debating and converting the local Protestants.
He writes theological tracts. He is playing the role of the perfect, devout, reforming rural bishop without a single flaw.
But we know that wasn't the end game. He's playing the good country priest, but his eyes are fixed firmly on Paris.
Yes, he is looking at the royal court, which is arguably the deadliest, most treacherous political arena in Europe, and he is calculating his entry.
How does a poor country bishop actually infiltrate that world?
The opportunity arrived in 1614. The crown was forced to call a meeting of the Estates General.
Which is incredibly rare. Let's explain the mechanics of this for a second.
The Estates General is basically a massive assembly of the three classes, or estates, of France.
Right. The first estate is the clergy, the second estate is the nobility, and the third estate is the commoners.
Correct. The French kings hated calling the Estates General because it gave the people a voice and a platform to demand things.
But the kingdom was in a financial crisis, so they had to assemble.
And the clergymen of the Poitou region chose their young, brilliant reforming bishop, Richelieu, to be one of their representatives in Paris.
So he steps onto the national stage, the lights are on him, and he does not waste his moment.
Not at all. He becomes the absolute mouthpiece of the church.
Over the course of the assembly, he maneuvers himself into a position to deliver the closing address on behalf of the entire First Estate.
And his speech is a masterpiece of political calculation. He demands that bishops be summoned to the inner royal councils.
He demands that the church be entirely exempt from taxation. He demands that Protestants who usurp Catholic churches be severely punished.
But it wasn't just what he said. It was the chilling, precise way he said it. His eloquence was razor sharp.
He ended his speech by turning directly to the young king, Louis XIII, who was only a teenager at the time, and assuring him that the clergy wanted royal power to be as a firm rock which crushes all that opposes it.
A firm rock which crushes all that opposes it.
I want you to really hear that phrase. That is not a spiritual message.
No, not at all.
That is not a priest talking about turning the other cheek or loving your neighbor. That is a brutal, violent political philosophy being whispered directly into the ear of a young, impressionable king.
And it immediately catches the attention of the real power in the room. The Queen Mother.
Marie de Medici.
Yes. Louis XIII was technically the king, but because he was so young, his mother, Marie de Medici, was the regent. She was the one actually holding the reins of the state.
And she was deeply impressed by this young bishop who spoke so eloquently of absolute crushing power.
Soon after the Estates General dissolved, she brought him into the inner circle. He was appointed as the almoner to the young king's new wife, Anne of Austria.
He was finally in the door.
And once he's in the door, he surveys the room, and he immediately aligns himself with the most powerful and arguably the most hated man in all of France.
Concino Concini.
Right. Concini is an Italian adventurer who's become the Queen Mother's absolute favorite. He's pulling her strings, which means he's pulling the strings of France.
Richelieu sees where the center of gravity is, and he orbits Concini. He makes himself useful.
And by 1616, his loyalty pays off. Concini gets Richelieu named Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs.
He has made it. He is 31 years old, and he has real national power.
But this is where Richelieu learns a terrifying lesson about the extreme volatility of the era.
Because power in the 17th century French court was entirely dependent on physical proximity to the monarch.
And proximity could mean death. Concini and the Queen Mother were deeply unpopular with the old French nobility.
And more importantly, the young king, Louis XIII, who is now 15, is tired of being a puppet.
He is tired of watching an Italian adventurer disrespect him.
So Louis secretly begins working with his own favorite, a man named Charles de Luynes, to take his kingdom back by force.
And in April 1617, the trap snaps shut.
But it's not a political trap, it's a physical one.
The king orders his royal guards to arrest Concini on the drawbridge of the Louvre Palace, with explicit instructions to kill him if he even twitches.
Concini resists. The guards shoot him point blank in the face.
They assassinate him right there in the courtyard. Marie de Medici is immediately placed under house arrest.
The entire power structure of France is violently flipped upside down in a matter of seconds.
And Richelieu loses everything. His patron is dead, his queen is imprisoned.
The young king is highly suspicious of anyone who was close to his mother.
Richelieu is immediately dismissed as Secretary of State. He is sent packing back to his bishopric, and eventually, in 1618, the king banishes him entirely.
Exiling him to the papal city of Avignon.
Right. So he's in exile. He knows the king and Louis are watching him, waiting for him to make a move.
Waiting for an excuse to execute him for treason.
Exactly. So how does a master manipulator disarm that level of suspicion? What is his cover story?
He sits down in Avignon and he writes a book, a holy book.
A catechism called Instruction du Chrétien. It was designed to be read aloud in every parish in France to cure the theological ignorance of the masses.
It was a brilliant, highly calculated piece of psychological camouflage.
The king is watching him, expecting him to plot a rebellion. Instead, Richelieu presents himself to the world as a harmless, devout, broken theologian.
A man who has abandoned politics and is now concerned only with the salvation of peasants' flesh.
But the paradox is staggering. He is writing a holy book to save souls, while sitting alone in his room, secretly waiting for a political bloodbath so he can return to power.
Because he knows Marie de Medici won't go quietly.
And he was absolutely right to wait. In 1619, Marie de Medici escapes her confinement at the Château de Blois.
She literally climbs down a ladder in the middle of the night.
She rallies the disgruntled nobles and starts an aristocratic rebellion. The kingdom is suddenly on the precipice of a devastating civil war.
The young king and his advisor, Lunens, realize they are in over their heads.
They realize they need the one man who has ever been able to successfully manage and manipulate the Queen Mother's volatile temper.
They have to call the priest back from Avignon.
Richelieu is recalled, and he executes a masterclass in diplomacy.
He actually steps in and orchestrates the Treaty of Angoulême.
He maneuvers perfectly between the two factions. He gives Marie de Medici her freedom and restores her to the royal council, but he ensures that she submits to the authority of the king.
He positions himself as the indispensable mediator.
The only structural beam keeping the royal family from collapsing the house on top of themselves.
The comeback is complete, and from here, his ascent accelerates rapidly.
By 1622, through the relentless lobbying of the Queen Mother, Pope Gregory XV makes him a cardinal. He gets the red hat.
Then, in 1624, he re-enters the King's Council of Ministers.
But he's not content to just be one voice among many. The chief minister at the time is a man named La Vieuville.
So Richelieu quietly goes to work. He uses his network to gather evidence of financial mismanagement.
He isolates La Vieuville, poisons the king's mind against him, and in August 1624 had La Vieuville suddenly arrested on charges of corruption.
The very next day, Cardinal Richelieu takes his place. He is the principal minister of France.
He has achieved absolute control.
He has the power. The question now becomes, what is he going to do with it?
To understand what happens next, to understand the sheer scale of the violence and the strategy that is about to unfold, we have to look at his grand strategy.
What was actually driving this man?
Richelieu was driven by, well, basically two overriding absolute obsessions, two goals that dictated every single decision he made for the rest of his life.
Okay, what were they?
First, the domestic unification of France, which meant brutally, systematically crushing any internal dissent. Second, the total destruction of the Habsburg dynasty.
Let's contextualize the Habsburgs. Because today, the name might just sound like dusty European royalty.
Right.
But in the 17th century, they are the superpower. They rule Spain, they rule the Spanish Netherlands, massive parts of Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire, which includes Austria and Germany.
If you look at a map, they effectively surround France in an iron ring.
They were a geographic, military, and existential threat to French sovereignty.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And Richelieu's very first major move on the international geopolitical board perfectly illustrates how far he was willing to go to break that ring.
It was called the Valtellina Crisis.
The Valtellina was a highly strategic narrow valley in the Alps in northern Italy.
Spain desperately wanted control of it to connect their territories in Italy with their territories in the Holy Roman Empire.
Now, the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church, had actually sent his own papal garrisons to occupy the valley to keep the peace.
Okay, stop the narrative cold right here. Let's look at the pieces on the board. The Pope's army is occupying this valley. Cardinal Richelieu is a prince of the Catholic Church. So what does he do?
He uses French military power and money to support the Protestant Swiss canton of Grisons to launch an attack to drive the Catholic Pope's garrisons out of the valley.
I want to make sure the listener really grasps this. A Catholic cardinal is funding Protestant mercenaries to shoot at the Pope's army. How does a man wearing a red hat justify this?
He justifies it through a terrifyingly modern philosophical concept that he basically helped pioneer: raison d'etat, reason of state.
Before Richelieu, wars were often justified by religion, right? Holy wars, just wars.
Richelieu shattered that paradigm. He believed that the national interest of the state superseded all other considerations, including religion, including theology, and including traditional morality.
Wow.
If the Habsburgs controlled that valley, the security of France was threatened. Therefore, the Pope's garrisons had to be removed, even if it meant allying with Protestants.
The survival of the state was the only moral imperative.
It is the absolute divorce of politics from theology.
But the hypocrisy of his power is breathtaking. Abroad, in foreign policy, he is allying with Protestants to weaken his enemies. But at home, inside the borders of France,
He is annihilating them.
yes, the Huguenots, the French Protestants, were not just a religious minority.
Thanks to previous treaties, they controlled dozens of fortified cities and maintained a significant independent military force.
They were effectively a state within a state.
Under the doctrine of raison d'etat, Richelieu could not tolerate any internal division or independent military capability.
In 1627, he personally took command of the royal army to lay siege to La Rochelle, the greatest and most impregnable Huguenot stronghold on the Atlantic coast.
And let's dive into the mechanics of this siege, because it shows his relentless clinical mindset.
La Rochelle was a port city. They were getting food and weapons shipped in from Protestant England. You couldn't just starve them out from the land.
So Richelieu orders his engineers to build a massive 1,400-meter-long seawall across the harbor.
It was a marvel of military engineering. He sank ships filled with rubble, drove massive wooden pilings into the seabed, and created a physical barricade.
That barricade completely blocked the English fleet from reaching the city. He completely cut off the city's blood supply.
And then he just waited. He starved the citizens out.
The suffering inside La Rochelle was apocalyptic. People were eating boiled leather, rats, and shoe paste.
Oh my God.
The city held out for over a year before finally capitulating in October 1628. Out of a population of nearly 28,000, only about 5,000 survived the starvation and disease.
And then in 1629, after this horrific violence, he orchestrates the Peace of Alais.
And this is classic cold-blooded Richelieu. He doesn't slaughter the survivors.
He doesn't force them to convert to Catholicism at sword point. He actually grants the Huguenots continued religious tolerance.
But he completely strips them of all their military power, their fortified cities, and their political assemblies. He disarms them.
The message is clear. You can pray however you want in your own homes, but you will never possess the physical capacity to threaten the French state ever again.
It was a surgical dismantling of an internal threat. But these wars, both the internal sieges and the external proxy conflicts, placed an astronomical strain on the royal treasury.
War requires immense logistics, and that costs money, vast sums of it.
So Richelieu aggressively, relentlessly raised taxes. He drastically increased the gabelle, which was the deeply hated tax on salt.
And the taille, which was the direct land tax.
And because the nobility and the clergy were largely exempt from these taxes due to ancient feudal privileges, this crushing financial burden fell squarely on the absolute poorest segment of the nation.
The peasantry.
Exactly.
So the people who have the least are paying for the massive geopolitical ambitions of the cardinal.
And to make sure the money was actually collected, Richelieu revolutionized the bureaucracy.
He bypassed the local feudal lords and the regional tax officials who usually skimmed off the top.
He created a new, terrifyingly efficient class of officials called intendants.
The intendants were the mechanism of absolute centralization.
These were direct agents of the crown, usually middle-class lawyers or administrators who reported only to Richelieu in Paris.
They were sent out into the provinces with sweeping powers to enforce tax collection and administer justice.
They had zero local sympathies, no ties to the local nobility, and absolutely no reason to show mercy.
Naturally, when you squeeze a starving peasant population that hard with merciless bureaucrats, something snaps.
Between 1636 and 1639, violent peasant revolts like the Croquants and the Nu-Pieds erupted across the country.
They are slaughtering tax collectors.
And Richelieu's response? It is devoid of mercy. He diverts hardened military regiments from the foreign wars to crush his own people.
He hangs the rebel leaders without trial.
He viewed the peasants exactly as he viewed the Habsburgs or the Huguenots, as a threat to the stability of the state that had to be neutralized by overwhelming force.
Let's take a look at the board at this exact moment. Let's look at the tension he has created.
Right, it's intense. The Spanish are openly mocking him, calling him the Cardinal of the Huguenots.
The Pope is furious with him for attacking papal troops. The peasants are bleeding and starving in the
The
mud.
old nobility hates him for sending the intendants.
And at this exact moment of maximum vulnerability, his oldest ally, the woman who brought him out of obscurity, the woman who gave him his start, decides it is time to cut his throat.
We have arrived at the climax of his early career, November 1630, a moment forever known to history as the Day of the Dupes.
Let's set the scene. The tension in the Luxembourg Palace is suffocating. Marie de Medici, the Queen Mother, has reached her breaking point.
She realizes she has created a monster she can no longer control.
So she allies with the king's own brother, Gaston d'Orléans, who is the heir to the throne.
They corner King Louis XIII in his chambers. They scream at him. They issue a brutal, emotional ultimatum.
It is us, your family, your blood, or it is the cardinal. You must dismiss Richelieu today.
And you must remember the psychological dynamic here. Louis XIII did not like Richelieu personally.
He respected his mind, he relied on his results, but he found the cardinal exhausting, overbearing, and constantly demanding.
Louis was a man who wanted peace, and Richelieu brought nothing but complex, stressful conflict.
So, presented with this hysterical demand from his mother and his brother, the king breaks. He agrees.
He tells his mother he will dismiss the chief minister.
The word spreads through the palace corridors instantly. The court turns their backs on Richelieu. The sycophants vanish.
People think he is finished. His enemies are literally celebrating, packing their bags, preparing to divide up his offices.
But they fundamentally underestimated the invisible machine Richelieu had built in the shadows.
His nascent spy network, his informants in the Talus, alert him immediately to the king's promise.
A lesser man would have fled into exile or begged for his life.
Richelieu doesn't flee. He orchestrates a private, desperate meeting with the king at a hunting lodge in Versailles.
And he employs absolute psychological mastery. He isolates Louis XIII from his family.
And then, he doesn't plead for his job. He paints a terrifying, mathematically precise picture of what will happen to France if Marie de Medici and Gaston take control.
He shows the king the map.
He convinces him that without Richelieu's ruthless hand on the wheel, the crown will fall to domestic ruin, the Habsburgs will encircle and crush them, and the entire kingdom will collapse into civil war.
He makes himself the indispensable man. And in a shocking twist, the king turns on his own mother.
He chooses the cold, calculating machine of the state over his own blood.
Marie de Medici is permanently exiled to Compiègne. Gaston's neutralized. Richelieu survives.
The people who thought they had duped him wake up the next morning and realize they are the dupes.
But this event caused a profound, irreversible psychological shift in Richelieu.
He realized how terrifyingly fragile his grip was.
He realized that as long as the feudal nobility possessed any independent power, any ability to sway the king or raise an army, he, and by extension the state of France, would never be safe.
A cold decision is made in his mind. He cannot just manage the old feudal world anymore. He has to dismantle it, brick by literal brick, by force.
Just pause for a second and think about what that actually means.
It's massive.
He wasn't just going to defeat his political rivals. He was going to tear down the physical and institutional architecture of their power.
Precisely. Let's look at the physical manifestation of that shift. In 1626, Richelieu had already begun issuing orders that were almost incomprehensible in their scale.
He ordered that every fortified castle in France that was not strictly necessary for the defense of the national borders was to be razed to the ground.
Let's use a modern analogy to understand the mechanics of this. Imagine a massive corporate hostile takeover. You are the new CEO,
Okay.
but all the regional vice presidents have their own private bank accounts, their own private security, and their own fortified regional headquarters.
If they don't like your policies, they can just lock the doors and ignore you.
What Richelieu did was liquidate all the subsidiary branches. He blew up their headquarters.
It was a surgical strike against the military capability of the aristocracy.
For centuries, a duke or a prince could retreat behind his massive stone walls, pull up the drawbridge, and defy the king's tax collectors.
Richelieu stripped them of their physical defenses. If you wanted to rebel now, you had to face the king's professional artillery in the open field, where you would be slaughtered.
He also abolished the position of Constable of France, which was the highest military command traditionally held by a powerful, independent noble.
He was aggressively centralizing all violence into the exclusive hands of the state.
And if taking their castles wasn't enough, he turned to judicial murder to intimidate the elites.
He wanted to make it crystal clear that if you crossed him, your high-born rank, your ancient bloodline, would not save your neck.
He ordered the execution of the incredibly powerful Duc de Montmorency for organizing a rebellion. The nobility was stunned. They thought they were untouchable.
He was sending a message written in aristocratic blood.
But it wasn't just armed political rebels he targeted. He went after anyone who challenged his narrative.
Break down the Loudun affair for us in 1634, because this shows the true darkness of his methods.
Urbain Grandier was a charismatic, handsome, and highly rebellious priest in the provincial town of Loudun. Crucially, he had been a vocal, outspoken critic of Cardinal Richelieu.
Even publishing scathing, insulting pamphlets about the cardinal's rise to power.
Suddenly, a convent of Ursuline nuns in Loudun claimed they were demonically possessed, throwing fits, speaking in tongues, and they accused Grandier of bewitching them.
So how does the chief minister of France react to a local witchcraft panic?
Richelieu saw an opportunity to permanently silence a critic and create a highly visible spectacle of terror.
He didn't let the local courts handle it.
No, he sent his own specially appointed commissioner, a man named Jean de Laubardemont, to oversee the trial. The outcome was entirely predetermined.
Despite a complete lack of credible evidence, and after enduring horrific torture that shattered his legs, Grandier was convicted of witchcraft and burned alive at the stake.
It was a clear, horrifying demonstration that Richelieu's reach extended into the very souls of his enemies.
If you wrote a pamphlet against the cardinal, you wouldn't just be arrested, you might be burned as a servant of Satan.
To maintain this suffocating level of control, to know what everyone was whispering in the dark, he needed eyes everywhere.
The Canadian philosopher John Ralston Saul actually calls Richelieu the father of the modern Secret Service.
Richelieu built a massive, terrifyingly efficient web of informants. And at the absolute center of this web, the spider sitting in the dark was his closest confidant.
A Capuchin friar named Father Joseph.
François Leclerc du Tremblay. He was known to history as the Eminence Grise, the Gray Eminence, because of the coarse gray robes of his monastic order.
While Richelieu, the Red Eminence, was the public face of power, wearing the brilliant scarlet silks, Father Joseph was his shadow. He was the covert operator.
How did this network actually function mechanically? Because they don't have wiretaps or encrypted emails.
They had something just as effective, the Cabinet Noir, the Black Chamber.
Father Joseph organized a system where the mail of suspected nobles, diplomats, and enemies was systematically intercepted.
Specialized agents would carefully melt the wax seals, copy the contents of the letters, and then reseal them with expertly forged stamps before sending them on their way.
The victims never knew their private thoughts were being read in Paris.
Beyond mail, Father Joseph used his network of fellow friars and monksmen who moved invisibly through society, taking confessions and hearing rumors.
To gather intelligence from every tavern and chateau in Europe, he orchestrated secret diplomatic missions and negotiated with foreign powers behind closed doors.
He made Richelieu's grand paranoid strategies possible.
And this surveillance state didn't just target the nobility or foreign spies, it targeted the church itself.
Remember, Richelieu is a cardinal, but he actively subjugates the Catholic Church to the French king.
He severely restricted the power of papal briefs from entering France without royal permission.
He actually funded two brothers, Pierre and Jacques Dupuy, to write a massive, heavily researched book called Les Libertés de l'Église gallicaine, The Liberties of the Gallican Church.
We need to define Gallican. Gallicanism was the belief that the Catholic Church in France should be largely independent from the Pope in Rome and instead should be under the administrative control of the French king.
The title of the Dupuy's book is deeply ironic.
It argued for the liberty of the French Church from Rome, but its actual functional purpose was to reduce the French clergy into servile, absolute submission to Richelieu's state.
And the clergy knew exactly what he was doing. When the local bishops and the papal nuncio complained, calling the book a work of the devil, Richelieu didn't back down or apologize.
He doubled down. He exaggerated his fiscal demands on the clergy. He threatened to confiscate their landed property if they didn't pay massive voluntary taxes to fund his wars.
The canonist Pierre de Marca even proposed breaking the Concordat of 1516 entirely, formally separating from Rome and making Richelieu the independent patriarch of a separate French church.
Pope Urban VIII was so enraged by Richelieu's insubordination, by his alliances with Protestants, and by his taxation of the clergy, that he systematically denied Richelieu the prestigious title of papal legate out of pure spite.
Which leads to a crucial psychological question. When you zoom out and look at all of this, he's basically building a 17th century surveillance state.
Yeah, he used Big Brother in a red robe.
He is razing castles, breaking the church, burning his critics alive, and starving out entire cities. Did he think he was the villain? When he lay in his bed at night coughing up blood, did he feel the weight of moral guilt?
The historical evidence suggests the exact opposite. Discussing the moral ambiguity of Richelieu is to confront a brilliant mind that had entirely, flawlessly rationalized its own cruelty.
How so?
He truly believed he was the immune system of France. He famously wrote a theological justification for his actions that is staggering in his cold logic.
He stated that man is immortal and his salvation is judged in the hereafter.
But the state has no immortal soul. The state has no afterlife.
Therefore, the salvation of the state must happen now, on earth, in this present reality, and it can only be achieved through raw power.
If he had to commit sins, if he had to lie, spy, and kill to save the state, he believed he was sacrificing his own personal soul for the greater good of France.
That is a chilling, terrifying justification. I will damn myself so the nation can survive.
And with that philosophical armor locked in place, he turns his gaze outward again. He drags France into the absolute bloodiest conflict of the century, the 30 Years' War.
But because of his domestic issues, he doesn't do it openly at first. He operates like a shadow puppeteer.
In 1631, he orchestrates the Treaty of Berwald, and this is a masterstroke of proxy warfare.
He secretly funnels massive amounts of French money squeezed from the peasants to fund the Swedish invasion of the Holy Roman Empire.
He is literally paying the great Protestant warrior king, Gustavus Adolphus, a massive annual subsidy to march south and slaughter Catholic Habsburg armies.
He transforms the entire nature of the war. It started decades earlier as a strictly religious conflict, Catholics fighting Protestants over theology.
Richelieu fundamentally changes its DNA.
Mm.
He changes it into a nationalist geopolitical war. It becomes the French state versus the Habsburg state.
And his strategy of funding proxies, letting the Swedes and the German princes do the dying while France just writes the checks, literally bankrupts the Habsburg Empire.
They exhaust their manpower and their silver fighting endless waves of enemies funded by Richelieu's relentless taxes. It is a war of economic attrition.
But here is where we encounter the most bizarre, fascinating contradiction of Richelieu's character.
While he is orchestrating this massive, continent-spanning geopolitical war, while he is managing spy networks and troop movements across Europe, he is simultaneously obsessed with the most minute, microscopic details of French culture.
He was the ultimate, inescapable micromanager.
You're not kidding. While funding armies in Germany, he is obsessively, personally overseeing the construction of his massive personal palace in Paris, the Palais Cardinal.
He is hoarding a vast collection of 900 rare manuscripts, and he demands they all be bound in matching red Morocco leather.
He is aggressively buying up original paintings by Leonardo da Vinci and Peter Paul Rubens. He's curating his legacy down to the color of the book bindings.
He even founded the Académie Française in 1635, and this wasn't just a book club.
He didn't just want to control the physical borders of France. He wanted to control the grammar and vocabulary of the French language itself.
He instituted a body of 40 members, the Immortals, to act as the supreme centralized authority on linguistic purity.
By controlling the dictionary, by dictating what words were acceptable, he was attempting to centralize French thought.
But my absolute favorite detail, the one specific thing that shows just how deeply his psychological need for control went, happens in 1637.
Right, the dinners.
He is hosting these lavish, highly tense political dinners at his palace, and he gets annoyed.
Because his aristocratic guests, these battle-hardened nobles, have this terrible habit of using their sharp-pointed hunting daggers to pick their teeth at the table, to spear their meat, and occasionally to threaten each other when drunken arguments break out.
It's chaotic. It's unrefined. It reminds him that they are still fundamentally violent warlords.
So Richelieu issues an order. He decrees that all knives on his dining table must have their blades dulled and their sharp tips completely rounded off.
He literally invented the modern table knife. But let's look at the psychology of why he did that.
It wasn't just about table manners. By taking away a noble's sharp dagger at dinner, he is fundamentally emasculating them.
He is taking away their personal weapons. He is forcing them to rely on the king's justice, the state's justice for dispute resolution rather than personal violence.
The man who orchestrated the starvation of La Rochelle couldn't stand the sight of a noble displaying independent violence at his dinner table.
His need for bureaucratic order extended across the Atlantic as well.
In 1627, he founded the Compagnie de la Nouvelle France to accelerate the colonization of Canada.
But in a stunning contrast to his domestic ruthlessness, where he is crushing peasants and burning priests, he mandates a highly progressive policy of peaceful coexistence with the indigenous peoples of North America.
Yeah, this is a fascinating contradiction. The Ordinance of 1627 actually declared that indigenous people who converted to Catholicism were to be considered natural Frenchmen.
They were legally allowed to live in France, acquire property, and be fully integrated into colonial society without any further declaration of naturalization.
It highlights the absolute paradox of the man's mind. He controls the proxy wars of Europe. He controls the grammar of the French language, the shape of the knives on the table, and the legal status of populations an ocean away in Canada.
He has engineered a system of almost total suffocating control.
But there is one thing, one biological reality that he cannot engineer. He cannot control his own body.
And he cannot control the chaotic nature of human ambition.
As we move into the final years of his life, Richelieu's physical frame, which had always been fragile, begins to completely collapse.
He is dying of tuberculosis, his lungs are failing, he has painful weeping abscesses on his arms.
And he knows his time is running out. He knows his entire apparatus of power rests on a single thread, his grip on the mind of Louis XIII.
But he is too sick, too exhausted to constantly manage the king's volatile moods and melancholies in person.
He needs to control the king's mind indirectly.
So he builds a Trojan horse. He finds a handsome, charismatic, deeply ambitious young man named Henri Coiffier de Rouzet, the Marquis de Cinq-Mars.
Richelieu had actually been a close friend of the young man's father. He brings Cinq-Mars to the court, dresses him up, and introduces him to the king.
The calculation was precise and, frankly, deeply cynical.
Richelieu hoped that Cinq-Mars would become the king's new favorite, a close, intimate confidant who would entertain Louis, go hunting with him, and soothe his anxieties.
But crucially, Richelieu expected Cinq-Mars to remain fiercely, unquestioningly loyal to his creator.
He expected him to act as Richelieu's biological puppet, whispering the cardinal's policies into the king's ear when the cardinal was too sick to do it himself.
And at first, the Trojan horse works perfectly. By 1639, Cinq-Mars is the royal favorite.
He is showered with titles, wealth, and affection by the king.
But Richelieu, the master of human psychology, made one fatal miscalculation. He forgot what raw, youthful ambition looks like when it isn't chained to discipline.
Cinq-Mars realized very quickly that as long as Richelieu was alive, he would never have any real political power.
He would only ever be a highly decorated distraction, a toy for the king, and a mouthpiece for the cardinal.
He refused to be controlled.
So the puppet decides to cut his own strings. In 1642, Cinq-Mars decides to orchestrate the final downfall of the Red Eminence.
He conspires with the usual suspects, the king's brother Gaston, and the disgruntled nobility who lost their castles.
But he goes much further than domestic intrigue. He commits absolute, undeniable treason.
He signs a secret physical treaty with the King of Spain.
The Spanish promised to provide troops and money to aid a rebellion that will assassinate Cardinal Richelieu, overthrow his government, and sue for peace.
It was a lethal existential threat. If the Spanish army linked up with a domestic rebellion led by the king's absolute favorite companion, Richelieu's entire life's work, the centralization of France, the weakening of the Habsburgs would be destroyed in a single afternoon.
But Cinq-Mars severely underestimated the very machine he was trying to dismantle.
Father Joseph had passed away, but the magnificent invisible spy network was still fully operational. Richelieu's agents intercepted a copy of the secret treaty.
You can almost imagine the moment Richelieu, coughing up blood into a handkerchief, weak and dying, reads that intercepted document.
He doesn't hesitate. He doesn't show mercy to his old friend's son. He takes the physical proof of treason directly to Louis XIII.
The king is confronted with undeniable black and white evidence that the young man he loved, the man he trusted, was plotting to invite a foreign Habsburg army into the heart of France.
Louis's dedication to the state overcomes his personal affection. He approves the use of capital punishment.
Cinq-Mars is promptly arrested, tried, and beheaded in September 1642.
It's a deep, Greek-level psychological tragedy. Richelieu's intense paranoia throughout his entire life was completely justified.
His ultimate creation, his hand-picked proxy, the boy he raised up to protect him, tried to have him killed.
It proved the terrifying, inescapable reality of his existence. Absolute power isolates you, absolutely.
You can trust no one, not your allies, not the king's family, and certainly not the proxies you create.
The execution of Cinq Mars broke something profound in the king, and he grew even more emotionally distant from Richelieu.
But it hardly mattered at that point. Time had finally run out for the cardinal. On December 4th, 1642, Armand Jean du Plessis succumbed to his illnesses. He died at the age of 57.
And the immediate reaction of the French people tells you everything you need to know about the staggering emotional and physical cost of his reign.
When news of his death reached the provinces, the peasants, the ones who had been crushed under the weight of the gabelle and the tail, the ones who had watched the intendants seize their property, they lit massive bonfires.
They celebrated in the muddy streets that the Red Eminence, the architect of their misery, was finally dead.
They celebrated, but they couldn't undo what he had built. The architecture he left behind was permanent.
He provided the exact operational blueprint for the absolute monarchy that King Louis XIV would use to dominate the next century.
He broke the back of the Habsburgs, a victory that was finalized just a few years after his death at the Battle of Lens in 1648.
He created the centralized, bureaucratic, ruthless state that defines modern governance.
Which brings us all the way back to where we started, to the French Revolution, 1796.
The people of France eventually rose up and tore down the absolute monarchy that Richelieu had so painstakingly built.
And in their rage against the state, they broke into the Church of the Sorbonne, where the cardinal was entombed.
They dragged his corpse out of the crypt, and someone, in a frenzy of historical vengeance, hacks the front of his head off.
It was passed around, exhibited as a curiosity, a physical symbol of defeated tyranny for decades, until Emperor Napoleon III finally ordered it returned to the Sorbonne in 1866.
It is the ultimate poetic contradiction of his life. He was a man of the cloth, buried in a holy church whose legacy is entirely, ruthlessly secular.
He was the architect who deliberately divorced morality from politics, permanently replacing theology with the cold, calculating mathematical logic of the national interest.
Look around you. The strict borders of modern nations, the intelligence agencies operating in the shadows reading our communications, the very idea that a government is justified in doing terrible, violent things as long as it is in the national interest.
That is not a natural law of the universe. That is the specific world Armand Jean du Plessis built. So, ask yourself, if the very foundation of our modern society, the way our states operate today, was forged by a man who fundamentally believed the end always justifies the means, what moral compromises are you blindly accepting today?